Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today I'm very honored to be talking with Judika Illes, who is an American author of esoteric nonfiction books, an aromatherapist, and tarot reader. Judika, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean.
For our readers unfamiliar with your work, can you talk about where you grew up and where you're from?
Yeah, I am from New York City. I was born in New York. Sometimes I feel like I'm a million years old, although I'm like still 15 years old inside.
Too.
I was born in New York. I am, for people who know what this is, I am a bridge and tunnel person. I was born in Brooklyn. I lived in Queens, and um, I am the first person in my family born in the United States. My parents and my sister were Hungarian refugees who only came to America a couple years before I was born. And I mean, my conscious memory is really in Queens, which even today is probably, it's considered one of the most diverse places on earth. If you go to a hospital, you'll see directions in something like 80 languages. And that was very much my upbringing. I have family all over the world. My ancestry is a little bit diverse too. And I think that really influences my work, that sort of feeling of being a worldwide person, a citizen of the world.
Were you interested in spirituality at a young age?
I don't remember a time when I wasn't. I come from a family that was also interested in spirituality, my mother, and in mysticism, not necessarily in what we would call witchcraft now in the modern sense, but definitely spirituality and mysticism, esotericism. I come from a house where I learned to read very early. My mother taught herself English by teaching me how to read. And I was reading by the time I was 3, and we had a house full of numerology and astrology and palmistry, all sorts of interesting books, and Zen Buddhism, all kinds of material.
Were you able to get materials on spirituality when you were young? Like you said that you had a lot in your household. Was there any like shops or any places around where you
Well,
live that you're able to get stuff?
I was, I was very lucky, very blessed, because I grew up in New York City, and I'm 62. So there was no Amazon.com where you could just
Right.
order books, or now there are so many online sellers that will ship you your conjure candles or whatever else you want. Right, now there's a glut. Now I think it's like the seven of this, it's overwhelming,
Yeah.
the amount of material there is. And I can't imagine being a beginner now. And where do you start? I mean, so many doors, so many possibilities. That wasn't the case. I mean, I really sort of came of age on my own in the 70s, and there really weren't a lot. But because I lived in New York and in the bedroom suburbs, there were stores. My sister went to college around the corner from the old Weiser bookstore, and
Oh,
she would,
wow.
and my sister began college when I began first grade, so she was bringing this material home. And there were witchcraft stores, the Magical Child and
Oh,
Enchantments,
yeah. I remember that.
right?
Yeah.
In New York City, even when there weren't other places, not to mention the botanicas, New York City, which are, for people who are not familiar with botanicas, those are Latin American spiritual stores, uh, stores with magical supplies, herbal supplies, spiritual supplies. And at one time, I remember my sister was living in Massachusetts, and I would take the Greyhound bus back. I would go to visit her in the summer, and I would come down and take the Greyhound bus back to the Port Authority in New York. And they would actually get into New York and New York City traffic. So it was a slow ride. and we would come from uptown Bronx, down through Harlem, down through the city, down to Midtown where the bus terminal was, and there would be a Botanica. The parts of the Bronx and Harlem, there'd be a Botanica on every other corner. It doesn't exist anymore because New York has become so expensive and the real estate is crazy, the prices. So that's a memory that really doesn't exist anymore. But I mean, I remember being on the bus and sitting at the window, and I was a teenager and literally writing down. I had like a little notepad, and I'd write down the names and addresses of botanicas as we drove by because I'd go back. And when I'd go and visit, and people were so kind to me and patient with me because I was a kid and I had no money, and maybe I bought a candle, maybe, and they just let me hang out and were very, very kind to me.
At what point did you kind of decide this is who I am? Like I am a
I was,
witch.
people ask me that, but I don't really, I don't really know a time when I didn't. I mean, I have really early memories of we were living in Elmhurst, Queens, and I would trick or treat for Halloween in the building. Like it was a apartment building. And so you wouldn't necessarily go outside. You would go door to door in the apartment. And I must have been, I don't know, 3, 4 years old. I was tiny. Um, I remember there was a St. Bernard dog that was a neighbor had that was significantly bigger than me. Um, it may as well have been a bear. And I was dressed as a witch. I've never not wanted to be a witch. I've never not. When you tell me fairy tales, even when I first heard them, Hansel and Gretel, I always identify with the witch. So, I mean, if you look at my natal chart, it's a pretty witchy chart. And I think I was just programmed like this. Here I am. I was born this way.
Has there been any point in your life that you've had hardships or had difficulty from people like landlords, jobs, whatever, what have you, or any kind
Husband.
of discrimination? Husbands, yeah, because you're a witch, yeah.
It was a very private thing for me. And it was not a problem with the job or with landlords because until I became published, because when I became published, that really pushed me out of because I never thought anyone would actually read my books. So I didn't think about getting an alias. This
Right.
is my real name, which in some ways, in the long run has been a good thing. But most metaphysical authors, not all, use some sort of a nom de plume. But
Right.
I thought no one will read my book. Why bother? That was my first book. And so well, they did. The joke was on me. And that kind of pushed me out of the broom closet all the way. It was a very personal thing to me. I was cautious. I mean, maybe I never really got in trouble because I was cautious about it. The person, my family didn't never had a problem with it because, of course, my family was aware. The worst thing I ever got from my family is a lot of eye rolling. I come from, educated intellectual people who,
Yeah.
you know, this is sort of, oh yeah, what's she into now? Like, I may be the family weirdo, but no one's gonna beat me or send me away to, I don't know, get rid of the witch or camp or something.
Yeah.
Um, but when I was married and it wasn't going well, my ex, I mean, I think he was being cynical about it. It was a control measure. I don't think he really, I mean, I know he didn't care.
Right.
He didn't care until I exhibited leave taking behavior, at which point he, I'm going to go to court and tell them you're a witch and you're going to lose custody. And, I believed him. I mean, it could have happened. I mean, he definitely, it kept me in a bad marriage longer than I would have been out of there otherwise.
Oh my God. Um,
I mean, that's not unusual.
yeah. Unfortunately, I've heard that story too many times.
I mean, it's not. I mean, I'm very aware. I am very aware that even as we speak, you know, there are places in the world where, witches are being burned, witches are being persecuted. parts of rural India, and there are pretty harsh anti-witchcraft laws in Saudi Arabia. And if you go
Yeah.
on YouTube, you can see there are some videos where they show you items that have been seized from practitioners. And, I do wonder what happened to the practitioner. Um,
Yeah.
Here's the stuff, but where's the person?
Yeah. Do you belong to any tradition that you'd like to talk about?
I am, I've got Aquarius rising, and I'm a very independent person, and I'm an independent practitioner. I do belong, I belong to the Fellowship of Isis, which is, allows you to be an independent person. And, it's I love them. I really, I am very fascinated by ancient Egypt and the magic and the deities and the spirituality. And so that was a very natural fit for me.
Were there any authors that influenced you while you were kind of coming up and discovering your spiritual path?
People ask me that a lot. And in terms of spiritual path, there are two answers to that. The writers that influenced me to become a metaphysical author were not also metaphysical authors. I came up at the time of the great rock and roll journalism.
Right.
People like Robert Christgau and Grill Marcus and Dave Marsh and Michael Gilmore, and just wonderful authors. And I I was a radio DJ in college, and I love music. I mean, a lot of my spells, I incorporate recordings into it. And I think that you can that there are songs. And I don't know if you've seen Najal Lightfoot's most recent book. I think it's Powerful Juju, because has a very similar path. I love her book. And so they taught me how to write about what I love, and to share the concept of sharing what you love with others, and to write with your heart on your sleeve, and to express your passions, because I love witchcraft and the occult. I thought I would be writing about music. That's where I started. In terms of what influences my spirituality, I'm a bit of a compulsive reader. I like, if you sit me down at a table, I'll read the back of the cereal box. I'll read if I'm in a diner and I have nothing else to do, I find myself reading, what's in the ketchup.
Yeah.
Let's look at, I'm just a compulsive reader, and I did start reading very early. And my recommendation to people is to read everything you can get your hands on. And in some ways, it was easier in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, because it wasn't so easy to get. And so you read what came across your path. And I read a lot of stuff that I disagree with, or I read a lot of stuff where there was one nugget of good information. And I think that I think a lot of people now, I see that they're looking for material to affirm what they already know or believe, to be validated. And that's good sometimes, but I think that to challenge your mind, to make you think, I don't like this book. I disagree with the author. Well, why? Why? Well, sometimes that helps you refine your own vision. But I read a lot of fairy tales, and I write about fairy tales. I read a lot of fairy tales from a young age, and that shaped my, I was really little, and I was maybe a little bit of a literalist, but it opened up possibilities, because in fairy tales you can do things, and contrary to what some people think, in fairy tales the the female characters are quite often the heroes and the protagonists. So
Yeah.
it opened up this world where, animals talk to you and you
Yep.
can accomplish the impossible. And, novels also, esoteric novels. I read, reincarnation novels very young, these old, and to this day, I love a reincarnation love story. And that was also, I mean, so I think pretty much everything, just the ability, just to have the material available and to open my mind to possibilities that all these things could be, that was that was very influential for me.
When did you realize that you were a writer? At what point did you decide this is what I want to do?
I didn't. Writing it's my skilled labor. It's just I'm good at it. And I come from, I mean, and maybe that's genetics because I come from a family with my great grandfather was a journalist. Um
Oh,
I come
yeah.
I come from a family with a lot of writers in it. Um Even now. So those are two different those are sort of two different things about me that have come together, are conjunct. One is I can write, and I've written and I've written websites for people, back in the day.
Yeah.
Among the many jobs I have had in my previous incarnations, in this lifetime, I wrote a funeral services website.
Oh,
If
wow.
you, I mean, if you wanted to hire me to write about sewage systems, I technically I can do it. I may not know anything, but I could learn. If you give me the material, I can. It's like some people can build a house. I mean, to me, writing is a very architectural thing. I can
Right.
I can construct, but it's why I'm a good editor because I can kind of look at writing and see it as a construction. But also the other side of that is, but another thing about me is that all my life I've been interested in esotericism and the occult and identifying with that witch and being that witch. So those are two things that came together. And they came together because at some point, I did end, I had a good marriage and then I had a bad marriage. And then the, the bottom fell out and I was a single mother with two kids and I needed to support them. And I was trying to do all kinds of other stuff, nothing worked. And my astrologer told me to write. And I told him he was crazy because, I was thinking of going to massage school, which is, very expensive. But I did not think that I was going. I mean, I am a writer. I did not actually think I was going to be making a living as a writer. It's just where my path took me.
You also have taught taromancy and other forms of divination. Can you talk about your inspiration for doing this and what led you to various forms of divination that you use?
I am primarily a tarot reader, but I think that when you are a diviner, and I've had this conversation actually with the great and recently lost Rachel Pollack. When you are, in the same way I say, I am a writer, I am a witch, I am a diviner. After a while, you can divine with anything because it's a mind thing, a mental thing. But
Yeah.
tarot is my favorite. It's my true love. My sister brought home a deck of tarot cards, the BOTA, Builders of the Diadem deck, from the Weiser bookstore, the Samuel Weiser bookstore in 1966. And I was a little girl and I just adored my sister and I would wait for her to come home every day. And, it was a great time. She was going to college in the East Village and sometimes she'd bring home books and sometimes she'd bring home I like to shop too. And sometimes she'd bring home albums, record albums. And one day she brought home a deck of cards and just I fell in love. It was the most amazing thing. And I love them. I love them. I mean, I'm sitting here now surrounded by cards. I like to share my love. I do other forms of divination. I love crystal balls. But I don't really do those professionally because I can't necessarily summon them. I used to be a phone psychic. Um, I used to, work on a telephone hotline, and I find that reading tarot cards is very reliable. If you have an emergency and you call me up at 4 a.m. and I'm having an emergency, read my cards, I can pick up the deck of cards and I can do it. Like I can literally wake up and just start reading the cards because I've been doing this I went professional in 1988. Um, and I like teaching the cards. They're one of my favorite. I do a lot of teaching and it's one of my favorite things to teach. I like to, there are a lot of misconceptions about tarot. And I think people, well, I'll give you an example. When I start teaching, I always ask people to tell me what you see.
Right.
Look at a card and tell me what you see. And so, for example, they'll pick the death card and they'll say, it's about change. It's not really about death. It's it's about change. And it's like, no, just tell me what you see. And that shifts because I think you have to be able to see. Seers, SEER, are people who see. And so if you if your head is full of, and I've been there too, because so many 78 cards, and we want to memorize all the meanings,
Yeah.
and it's a lot of pressure. And it took me a very long time, years, to be comfortable to read for other people. I was so self-conscious and so nervous. And what if I can't think of anything to say or I don't see anything? And you need to learn to see. And once you learn to see, you can pretty much. I did a reading once with Pokemon cards because that's all we had. It was a good reading. So once you learn to see, you can do it.
In 2012, you gave a workshop using symbols as parts of the Symbols and Signs art show at the Observatory in Brooklyn. Can you talk
Yeah,
about this workshop?
yeah, I love doing that workshop. Um, why did I do that workshop? Well, there's two. The short answer is because the wonderful Pam Grossman, who was one of the curators of it was in an art gallery, and she was among the curators of that art gallery in Brooklyn. She asked me to do it, and pretty much I would do anything Pam asked me to do. So that's the short answer. But the long answer is I really like symbols and the power that radiates from symbols. I you don't really, I mean, my big book, the book that most people know me for, is Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells. But and it does have more than 5,000 spells. But because of the format of writing, it has very specific kinds of spells. Like
Yeah.
you can cast spells through painting or through um, crafts like sewing or embroidery. There you can there are a lot you can pretty much cast a spell with anything, but it doesn't lend itself to that kind of a formatted book description. And
Right.
I like symbols for the power, that radiant power. That I mean, right now I'm wearing an evil eye. I have an ankh on. I haven't. I have worn an ankh every day since the pandemic started, and I recommended it. I recommend it to others. If not an ankh, then a chai, the Hebrew symbol, the chai. Um, these are life affirming symbols and symbols that radiate protection against poor health and anything that threatens your life. So I find that kind of I personally find that kind of magic very interesting. And that's what we were exploring there. There was an art exhibit that included, it was an esoteric art exhibit that had works of art featuring, magical art featuring symbols. And then we came in and we did a workshop that was thematically similar to that. I enjoyed that one.
In 2001, you wrote Earth Mother Magic, a complete course in spell casting that was later published under the title Pure Magic, the Big Book of Practical Spells. Can you talk about this book and how you came to get it published?
Yeah, that's my first book. And that book has had a journey. It's a very complicated publishing history. It was actually written originally in 1999 and should have been published in 2000, but the publisher went bankrupt, the original one. I have an unpublished manuscript on fertility, which does have a lot of symbols in it, that I have been trying to get published since about 1998. And the reason it hasn't been published, and I'm probably going to try it again now, maybe now it's a little bit less bookstore focused. The reason selling books, the reason it hasn't been published is not the content, but because the content is so diverse. Where does it go in a bookshelf? And booksellers, particularly the bigger ones, tend to be very conservative about these things. You know, this book has herbs and aromatherapy, but it also has magic, and it has spirituality, and it has goddesses, and where do we put it? But it is a book about something that people might perceive as health, or does it go in women's studies, or where? And it makes publishers nervous. I think that now with so many more online sellers, maybe it'll be easier. Every time I try to get this book published, I mean, it gets turned down, but it's been very, very fertile for me because somebody offers me something else. And I didn't know how to send a book out to publishers or to agents. And so I just took everything I knew and I threw it together. Ironically, it turned out to be kind of the prototype for 5,000 Spells. It's organized very, very similarly. And it had a chapter of magic spells. And a publisher turned down the manuscript. He described it as a downer. But he liked the chapter of magic spells. And he asked me, would I expand it into a book? And I said, sure. Because for me, that would, as I said before, I could write you a website in sewage systems, but a book on spells, I've been like training for that my whole life. And he told me it was going to be called, he had a title, it's going to be called Earth Mother Magic, which I did not like, but I really wanted to get published, so I wasn't going to tell him that. And it was going to look like the Moosewood Cookbook. They had the cover art, which is beautiful, before I wrote the manuscript. And I went home, I bought a copy of the Moosewood Cookbook. And I mean, it's actually pretty funny. I sat on the floor with this is back in the day when you did not email manuscripts, you had paper manuscripts. And It's a big book. So there's a big stack of papers. And I put it next to the Moosewood Cookbook. And I was moving my head back and forth. Like, how did he get from my manuscript to the Moosewood Cookbook? Because I was trying to figure out what I was so afraid this was going to I really wanted to be published. I had so many rejections. I could have papered a wall with them. And I was just so worried this was going to dissolve. But I also was very uncomfortable with the title, Earth Mother Magic, because to me, that's environmental. And if you're going to be environmental, then let's not be hypocrites. Trees get cut down to make paper. So, and I also didn't think anybody was going to read it. There were already a lot of witchcraft books out there. And I thought, what am I going to do? So I decided I was going to write a very honest book as an authentic urban practitioner. And that's what I did. And it's a book with no agenda. I'm not going to tell you what to believe or what your faith should be, or I'm just going to teach you how to cast spells and how to work with, casting spells is really interacting with the universe. So there's, chapters on crystals and on botanicals, ranging from live plants that you plant in a garden to essential oils and flower essences. How do you communicate with spirits? How do you work with animal spirits? And so I did this, and actually, I had an agent Well, the agent who sent out my original manuscript abandoned me because she didn't want to do witchcraft books. She thought this is going to be a huge,
Yeah.
groundbreaking fertility book. So she just abandoned me. It took forever to get my contract. The original publisher was Element Books, which was in Boston at the time, before it was
Yeah.
purchased by HarperCollins. They went bankrupt. Um, and the editor I had been working with, who had been the vice president at Element, um, they started the Fair Winds imprint. And I don't know if it's the same management now, but that book is one of the three first books published by Fair Winds. And I mean, long story short, when it went out of print, which it did, that the original edition, Earth Mother Magic, if you have one, anyone listening, hold on to it. There were only 3,000 copies printed, and they are going for a lot of money now. It's like book scalpers. It is going for a ton of money right now. And it was then reprinted by Weiser Books, originally as Pure Magic, and there's a very beautiful cover with a flower. And then when they did a new edition of that called The Big Book of Practical Spells, which is essentially the same book. And last year we published. I mean, it's kind of amazing to me because I was really convinced that no one would ever buy that book. And 20 years later, it is a Weiser classic. There was a new edition called, they reverted to the Pure Magic title. Matt Oren wrote a foreword that made me cry in a good way, but it was wonderful. And there's an audiobook that they let me read, which, they very rarely let authors read their own audiobooks. So that was just an amazing experience to me. And here we are.
I didn't know there was an audiobook version. I want that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, they let me go into a studio and do it. That was amazing.
Oh,
And you have to know, I mean, I could barely speak out loud till I was like well over 30. So I was a little, even English is not my first language. And I did not, I learned English like I went from Hungarian to Spanglish to, I mean, I was not speaking standard English until I, moved to New Jersey, and other children let me know I wasn't doing it right. So it was it was pretty traumatic. So to be, asked to narrate an audiobook with, the engineers will tell you if you do anything wrong. That was like incredible. It was just one of the highlights of my life. I mean, it's
so
actually, we
go ahead.
recorded it last March, so it's almost a year since the recording.
Oh, I got to get my hands on that one. So you wrote in 2001 Earth. Sorry, I'll edit this part
Yeah,
out.
the journey that became Earth Mother Magic began in like 1999. I want to say Element Books went bankrupt in 2000. I was so lucky, so blessed, because the book had been edited but not yet printed, because the
Oh yeah.
books that had been printed and were in the warehouse just like got lost. They were never published. So we and then I had to decide. I mean, I was really in despair. I thought it was never going to be published. But then Fair Winds wanted it, and HarperCollins, who purchased Element, wanted it. And I ended up going with Fair Winds because that's where the original editor was. And he had taken a chance on me. So I thought, well, everybody told me to go with HarperCollins. But I thought, oh, well, he took a chance on me. I should take a chance on him, which turned out to be the wise choice, because he ended up at HarperCollins UK. And that's how I wrote 5,000 Spells.
So after the first two books, what changed for you? Were you getting offers from publishers to do other works, or what did you wanted to do at that time?
I wrote, I mean, it was a very turbulent time in my life. I wrote Earth Mother Magic, which is now Pure Magic, in California, but
Mhm.
my marriage had ended, and I was financially very challenged. And at some point, and by the time it was published, I was living in New Jersey. I'd come back to the East Coast. I mean, where my family was, I couldn't, I mean, I literally had cash that I'd getaway money in a safe deposit box. And I knew like when I got down to that money, there was nothing. I mean, we were like pulling nickels out of sofas, that kind
Yeah.
of no money. Um, so I was in New Jersey. It took a while. And then I wrote two books. I wrote Earth Mother Magic, and then I wrote a little book when I got back, also for Fair Winds, called Emergency Magic, which is now Magic When You Need It, which has been republished at Weiser. So
Right.
that's available like that. And they didn't, they sold and I got a little attention. I got offers not from publishers, but from booksellers, bookstores. I got on what is often called the incense circuit, which I don't know if that exists anymore post pandemic, but there was, there were all these stores and events and conferences where you would go and teach. And that was what opened up for me. And I got to meet other occultists and writers. And, Dorothy Morrison, the author Dorothy Morrison, was so kind to me. I don't even think she remembers, but she was so kind to me when, because when she was asked to do an event and she already had a booking, she would recommend me.
Oh,
And
nice.
she's, I have very fond memories of that time because this is before social media. People in the witchcraft community were very supportive of each other.
Yeah.
And I try to be supportive of others also. And I think there is social media in some ways has enabled us to meet more people and to have more opportunities. But the downside of that is that there's a meanness, and I think for some anonymity, you can say terrible things and lies about other people. And, there's no,
Yeah.
we're a little community. We should be supportive of each other. So then Greg Brandenburg, who was the one who offered me Earth Mother Magic, had gone to work for HarperCollins UK, Harper Element. See, my Element encyclopedias, people think that's part of the title. It is, but it refers to the publisher.
Right.
It's, so it's like the Element Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells and the regular Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells. They're the same book.
Yeah.
Just the American edition doesn't want to pay tribute to the British publisher, which,
Right.
understandably. So he asked me to write 5,000 spells. And we were idiots. We're not mathematicians. We're he because the earlier book, Emergency Magic, Magic When You Need It, has 150 spells. And this is another topic, but I collect spells, or I did
Right.
more at the time. Now they're so, now you go online and everybody's like screaming free spells at you. It's like almost too much. And you don't really
Yeah.
know where they come from. But at that
Right.
time, I mean, originally it was just through gathering material for my fertility book. I kept finding all this other interesting stuff. And I was just putting it on file cards because it was interesting. I didn't know that I was ever going to do anything about it, but I just said, oh, this is interesting. I'll never find it again. I won't remember. Let me write it down. And so he knew I had boxes and boxes and boxes of these. And he started asking me, can you do 1,000 spells? Yeah, and I was still trying to sell him my fertility book. So I wasn't really, can you do 5,000 spells? Can you do 10,000 spells? And I'm like, sure, because spells are like grains of sand on the beach.
Yeah.
Spells are born every minute. You can, you could, I could write 5,000 more. I'm not suggesting I would, but I theoretically could. Um, so I began writing that. He hooked me. He seduced me. And I wanted to write that book. So I did. But we miscalculated. How many pages do you need to write 5,000 spells? I don't know. 450, that's a big book. I said, okay. I have a contract for 450 pages. for those who haven't seen the book, it's over 1,000 pages. And I wrote the introduction, and it was 100 pages, and I knew I was in trouble.
Yeah.
And I am a very prompt person. I'm very punctual, obsessively so. And then 5,000 spells, I was late. It's the first time in my life ever late for anything, and I was really late. And I thought they were going to cancel the project, and I did not. I never saw the whole book until it was published. It was just, weeping as I was writing. I'm glad I did it. It was a harrowing experience. And then at the end, they asked me to write another book. And I thought, oh, no one is going to. I mean, this is before, now folk magic is a big deal. 5,000
Right.
spells is mainly folk magic, and it was not popular at that time. I mean, I'd like to think 5,000 spells opened the doors to that. And I just thought, no one is going to read this book that I've been, going broke over writing, because it's all I did for 9-10 months. I did nothing but write that book. And, if they do read it, they're not going to like it. So I better sign a contract fast. I mean, I didn't know. I was very naive. I didn't know they knew about pre-orders. I didn't know. They didn't tell me. Publishers often don't tell writers things like this.
No.
So I wrote 4 encyclopedias in a row. I was just exhausted. So I mean, that's the upshot. But writing books, I think, especially, the metaphysical community, the witchcraft community, is really wonderful because they value authors in a way that other communities maybe don't. Authors kind of become celebrities.
Yes, very much so.
Very much so, whether deserved or not deserved. But I mean, it is nice to have a community that values literature and writers. So it is like a passport writing. It opens doors within that community. Outside, I go to the supermarket, no one cares.
Yeah. In 2009, 2010, through onward to 2011, you published a lot. You published in 2009 the Encyclopedia of Spirits, the Ultimate Guide to Magic and Fairies, Genies, Demons, Ghosts, Gods, and Goddesses. In 2010, you published the Weiser Field Guide to the Paranormal. And in 2010, you published the Weiser Field Guide to Witches. And then in 2011, you published the Encyclopedia of Mystics, Saints, and Sages, the guide to asking for protection, wealth, happiness, and everything else. I look at these titles and I'm like, that looks like a lot of work. How did you get through this period?
Well, I did 2 books for Harper Element, for Harper UK, the 5,000 Spells Encyclopedia of Witchcraft. And then they stopped publishing in the US. And I was like their only US author. It's a British division of HarperCollins. And, so I was sent over to Harper One, which is the American division of HarperCollins that publishes a lot of spiritual material. And I wanted to do Encyclopedia of Spirits. 5,000 Spells in Witchcraft had been suggested by pretty much every book up to that had been suggested by the publisher. But Encyclopedia of Spirits was originally going to be called The Care and Feeding of Spirits, which is what the introduction is called. But that was my original title. I wanted to do that. And when I was doing it, I wanted to include saints and angels in there. I wanted you to be able to see the goddess Bridget and Saint Bridget side by side.
Right.
And there are a number of, I just thought it was so interesting to look at this side by side. But they were very adamant what they wanted, because 5,000 Spells had been so successful. They wanted 5,000 spirits. I said, well, we can't do that because it'll be a dictionary. It won't be an encyclopedia. Right. I need room to write, because when I write about spirits, I want you to know them. I want to give a good portrait. I want to give you at least enough for you to start working with them if you want to. And we finally decided on 3,000. We were going to do 3,000. I did. I wrote 3,000. I have a lot of outtakes. And then I did what they wanted, and it was like a 14,000 page manuscript. And you would have had to sell it with like a little red wagon to bring it home from the bookstore. It was you couldn't, when 5,000 Spells was first published, the hardcover edition, Amazon wouldn't do free shipping. That book
Yeah.
weighed over 5 pounds. So
Yeah.
that's why there's so many different versions of it, because they kept trying to get it to, and they finally did, a size that was contained the same book. The pagination is the same, but the cover was light enough to be mailed for free for like prime shipping. So I wanted to, so then we had to cut because we couldn't publish a book that size. So we pretty much kept only the pagan spirits. We cut the angels, we cut the saints, and we published that book. And my books, these are not new books. My books, what they call backlist, they backlist well. 5,000 Spells, even now, Encyclopedia of Spirits, even now, if you look on Amazon, top whatever, 20, 25 spiritual books, they're magical encyclopedias, reference, they're usually up there near the top. And this is a book that it's not that new, and yet it continues to sell. But this was around the 2008 crash, and what they wanted was a book that would open like a blockbuster movie. They wanted a blockbuster weekend. And my books are, they're not, you get a lot of book for your money, but they're not a $14 book.
Right.
So, it wasn't selling fast enough. And so I offered them an Encyclopedia of Angels. They didn't want it. I offered them Saints. They didn't want it. So I didn't know what to do with myself. And then Weiser asked me if I would do a field guide to witches for them. And that was great because that was like a little mini encyclopedia. I had been struggling with these huge books, Encyclopedia of Spirits, also over 1,000 pages. I had fun writing that. So that one I could do fairly quickly, and I sent it to them. And then they had this field guide series. Ray Buckland wrote the first book, Field Guide to Ghosts. It's a nice little series. I did the last two. They had another author who was going to do, I think, a field guide to maybe paganism. But, well, I mean, Isaac Bonowitz became very ill and could not complete that book. And they really wanted to have another book in the series. And they asked me because I write these big books. I mean, I can write a small book pretty fast. Could I, at the last minute, could I do a field guide to the paranormal? And I said, sure. And because it was coming out so close to the field guide to witches, they asked me to do it under an alias. Because traditional publishing wisdom is that an author shouldn't have too many books at the same time because it cuts into sales. So I wrote the field guide to the paranormal. And so they came out within months of each other. And that's, I think, it's written under the name Judith Joyce. It's, I think, my least well-selling book, but it's probably some of my best writing, and I really like it, and I wish people would read it. Because the paranormal, because I write as an occultist, and I write about extraterrestrials, and I write about mediums and spiritualism, but I'm not distanced from it. And I think that the perspective, it's a very integrated perspective. And then in the meantime, Encyclopedia of Spirits started selling. And HarperCollins decided, well, maybe we do want that book on saints. So, and I wanted to write it by then. I mean, it's sort of unbelievable to me. If you had asked me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, would I be writing an Encyclopedia of Saints, I would have laughed at you. But I work with them a lot now, and I appreciate them. And so that was Encyclopedia of Mystics, Saints, and Sages. And it is called that because, especially in the English language, the word saint has become so exclusively tied to Christianity and especially Catholicism. People think those are the only saints, but the phenomenon of saints, the powerful dead, the powerful and generous dead, it's common to many traditions. And no, there are folk saints who are not associated. Joan of Arc was a French folk saint for 500 years before the Vatican deigned to canonize her. And there are Buddhist saints and Hindu saints and Jewish saints and Sufi saints and Zoroastrian saints. But a lot of people don't like using the word saint because they think you're saying they're Catholic and they're not. So it's mystic saints and sages. And then I
Yep.
was just so exhausted after that. And
I
my
can
parents were
imagine.
old. And I don't know that I could have written any more at that point. And my parents were really like I stopped writing, looked around. My parents were very old. And I took care of my parents until they died. So that was a couple years after that.
Now,
And
go ahead.
no, no.
In 2016, you published the Weiser book of the Fantastic and Forgotten, Tales of the Supernatural, Strange, and the Bizarre. You were the editor of this work in anthology. Can you talk about it a bit?
So after my parents died, I looked around and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I could, I was teaching a lot. But for me to teach at that time, now I do a lot of virtual teaching. But
Right.
at that time, that didn't really, that was very rare. It didn't really exist. Um, so it meant travel, and my kids didn't like that. And it was a chaotic way to live. And you never, it's very hard to predict, you know, what your annual income is going to be. Um, and I am a working woman. So I was offered a position to, it was a long time coming. I used to complain. I was given books by Weiser, my other publishers, to endorse. When a book comes out, often you will be another author will be asked to sort of give an opinion, give a good housekeeping stamp of approval. And I would get these books, and not just from Weiser, from other publishing houses, and I would see that the editors who knew grammar did not know the content. And so often there were mistakes that they didn't catch because they didn't understand the content, the esoteric content. And I used to, because I was friendly, because Amber Goutebier, who at that time was the editor at Weiser, and she had been my editor on Magic When You Need It and Pure Magic, I would tell her, you should hire me to edit because I understand this. And these mistakes would not be here. And by the time I saw them, it was almost like too late to change them. And so eventually they did hire me.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm an editor of Weiser Books. I went to work for Weiser in 2015. I've edited, upwards of 100 books by now. So I there was a series of occult fiction. I curated two of the books, the one you mentioned, the Weiser Field Guide to the Fantastic and Forgotten, and also the Weiser Book of Occult Detectives. There is a third earlier book in the series that was curated by Lon Milo Ducat. And I love those books because what I was saying before, in my childhood, I read a lot of old esoteric fiction, Dion Fortune and um, Marie Corelli. And, I'm reading The Devil Rides Out right now, the Dennis Wheatley book.
Which is a great book.
Oh, yeah, I never read it before. So this is very interesting. Um, I have the opposite. So they're short stories. They're occult fiction, but I am presenting them. The Weiser is a publisher of the esoteric, and I am an occultist because usually you see these stories and they're published someplace, and they are presented as literature exclusively, and they're introduced by people who maybe don't understand the esoteric content. So I chose all the stories. I wrote the introductions. I wrote introductions to the stories, and I love them. And I wish people would go out and buy them because everybody wants to write esoteric fiction and no one actually wants to purchase it. And I would love to do more. I have a haunted house book ready to go, but no one actually buys these books, so they languish. So there they are.
Well, I'll be putting links to these books in the bio, and if you're listening to this and you're interested, please do purchase it.
They're
Although I don't think I don't think anybody will need a lot of urging, because I know I'm already looking to
they're
purchase these
you
as
know
well.
they're fun, but they're also substantial, and some of them have like esoteric substance, because especially the stories that were, until the 1950s, 1960s, it was very hard to get esoteric nonfiction published. It was
Yeah,
illegal in Britain to publish anything that could be seen as extolling or teaching the occult.
right.
So what people did is they wrote fiction, they wrote stories, and and they're good stories, and you don't need to know anything. You can just enjoy them as stories. Occult detectives, they're mysteries. But if you do have the eyes to see, there's a lot of esoteric content in them, because that's how they were taught. You have to slip them in. It's like my dog. I used to, he wouldn't take his medicine, so I'd slip it into a piece of salami for him, and then he'd eat it. So it's like the content. It's so interesting in a lot of them, and great writers, Helena Blavatsky and Dion Fortune. Just really, really, there's I think uh, Arthur Conan Doyle story.
Judika, what's next for you?
Well, my most recent, so after Mystic Saints and Sages, I did not write. I've written a lot of forewords. I wrote 5 forewords last year. Um, I've written a lot of forewords. I've edited a lot of books, and then in 2020, I did another book of original material, which is Daily Magic, and that's
Mhm.
from Harper One. And that I wanted to tie the 4 encyclopedias together. Daily Magic is a perpetual calendar. It's a calendar of spells and rituals that all these books stand alone. But I think if you have them together, they complement each other. And that came out, oh, maybe I don't even know. That one, it got delayed by the pandemic. It was going to be published in 2020. Maybe it was published in 20, the dates like slip by me at this point. Um, I would like to publish my fertility book. I may send that one out again. I have a couple other books in my head. I have a tarot book. I have another saint book. I have, I try not to talk about this stuff too much. I didn't tell anybody I was pregnant until you could see it when I had my
Yeah.
children. And I don't talk about my books in progress until they're in a catalog. And it's like, for sure. But I do have now some books in my head that I'm thinking of doing. I added for Weiser. There are some great books coming out. Um, Rachel Pollack's A Walk Through the Forest of Souls, a new edition of that. There is a book by David Shee called Spirit Voices, The Magic and Mysteries of North Asian Shamanism, The Evil Eye by Antonio Pagliarulo, The Magic in Your Genes by Carol Crow. Those are all coming out in May. June, Stephanie Rosebird, African American Magic. And I've got new books. I'm working on new books from Denise Alvarado and Amy Blackthorne and Sarah Mastros. Uh, uh, Scott Cunningham's younger sister has
Oh,
written a
wow.
book. Yeah, that'll be out
I didn't
later
know
this
that.
year. Oh, it's up for pre-order already. Scott Cunningham, The Path Taken, written by Christine Cunningham Ashworth, and that's a great book too. So
Nice.
I'm just immersed in books. That's my life.
Judika, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I've loved getting a
Oh,
chance to
thank
talk to you.
you.
It's been an
That was a
honor.
pleasure. Thank you.